For many years now, we have been gathering on 2 Wednesday mornings a year after the primary in New Jersey and after the general election to bring in a panel of distinguished, sleepy people to give first or maybe second impressions of what happened yesterday and what it means as we go forward. I was thinking that people talk a lot about how we need more political compromise, and if compromise is an outcome where nobody gets exactly what they want and everybody gets something, I guess that may be what we had yesterday. I'm going to ask, excuse me, ask each of the speakers to say a few words, and or more than a few words, and then we'll have a discussion amongst us and have time for some questions to come in from people here and people watching online. Our panel, let me introduce them all first. Herb Jackson is a former editor of the Targum. Mike, and also is the right, and is also a Washington correspondent for the Bergen Record. Michael Hill is a correspondent with New Jersey TV. Debbie Walsh is the director of the Center for American Women and Politics at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Julie Roginsky is a Democratic strategist. Mike DuHaime is a partner at Mercury, a public affairs firm, and also an adjunct faculty member teaching here in this room every Tuesday evening except last night. So let me start with Herb, and what were your first thoughts from yesterday and last night?
I'm tired. Well, I mean, the big takeaway I would have is I watched the last 2 years as House Republicans tried to figure out how to operate in the age of Trump. And you saw that Tom MacArthur moved further to President Trump's side. He was the only one who voted for the tax bill. He helped us revive the American Health Care Act, which passed the Senate with passed the House with the MacArthur amendment and then died when John McCain put thumbs down. Leonard Lance, Rodney Frelinghuysen, Frank LoBiondo, Chris Smith, all sort of hewed their own way, and Lance apparently got no credit for it last night. And I would say that, you know, it was made clear to me that Lance's district and MacArthur's districts are different, especially as far as how the tax bill works and the state and local tax deduction. All you need to know is try to find a $325,000 house in Leonard Lance's district. So we're talking about different places in Burlington and Ocean than you are in, you know, the span of New Jersey that goes from Hunterdon County out to Summit. I think New Jersey's going to miss Rodney Frelinghuysen's experience and knowledge. Mike DuHaime will probably tell you more than me, but Rodney was able to manage to get earmarks into the transportation bill at the beginning of this year when you're not allowed to get earmarks in. That transportation bill still hasn't passed, and we'll see what happens when we come back next week, whether we can do some sort of tunnel for wall deal. The Senate race was ugly. My colleague Nick Puglisi talked to Bob Hugin last night, and Hugin told him he did not call Menendez to concede because he thought it would be disingenuous, because Menendez thought I said things about him that were untrue, and he said things about me that were untrue. So there's no love lost between two guys from Union City, and we'll see whether Bob Hugin comes back somewhere else in politics, or if his kids say, "Dad, stop spending all our money." The second district race was over before it began, but as far as I know, Seth Grossman still hasn't conceded. You're going to see the third district, MacArthur and Kim, go into overtime. We probably could have predicted this when the state passed a law that said you could vote until Friday by mail. And so anybody who was within the potential margin of error would be foolish to have conceded or declared victory on Tuesday night. And you know, I think, what are you going to do when you have an election that gives Democrats a big win in the House and the Republicans more seats in the Senate, and the people who are coming back from the Republican side were all fired up to not compromise with the Democrats? I don't know how we're going to get through, frankly, the remaining appropriations that we have to get through for this fiscal year. which, you know, the budget runs out on December 7th, I think. So we could have a partial government shutdown. And it's going to take some real leadership for people to get things done. And the Senate is going to, you know, the last thing I'll say is the Senate is just going to keep pushing judges through. We've got an appellate judge for this circuit coming up in the Judiciary Committee next week. And this was somebody who Senator Menendez and Senator Booker did not provide their blue slip for, meaning that Senator Grassley has thrown out the practice of letting home state senators you know, get a sort of veto power on nominees from their state. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this guy. He served in the Christie administration. But it's just a sign of how much more hardline partisan it's going to be going forward, and the Senate used to think it was better than that.
Michael? Michael you were on TV until, I don't know what time last night, 2 o'clock?
Till the wee small hours of the morning. That's what it felt like.
Nice voice.
Thank you.
Do you sing the Correspondent?
No, I don't. I did it once, and it was a
now.
disaster. I thought leaving the station last night and watching the returns, especially New Jersey, that what a difference 2 years makes. And the reason I say it is because in leaving the station, not that it was just the station, 2 years ago, how dejected a lot of people were because of the results. And I compare it to what happened last night, not just at the station, but in other places I've been and seen just some of the public reaction. And it's a huge difference. After living in Missouri, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas, I can say last night for New Jersey, Democrats, Staten Island, upstate New York, Democrats really voted like Democrats. And I hadn't seen that for a long time in a lot of places where I've lived. Another takeaway for me was the power of, as much as exit polling showed that the man in the White House was a factor for a lot of people being enthusiastic about this election cycle, he still is a formidable campaigner. He has formidable power, and I don't think that there's anybody in, especially the Democratic Party, should discount the strength this man has outside of strong blue areas like New York and New Jersey and things like that. This man knows the buttons to push. He pushed them during the re-election cycle here, the midterm cycle here, and with some pretty good success. Another takeaway for me is the cornerstone. This is, I don't mean to sound preachy. The cornerstone of democracy is voting. Why can't we get this right? Why do people show up with soggy ballots that you can't put into a voting machine? We have made such incredible advances in knowledge and technology and so forth, and we still can't get this right? The democracy is this old, and we still can't get it right? Voter suppression, irregularities, all kinds of things. It's 2018. We need to get this right. And I am not a candidate for public office.
Now you are.
Debbie?
So I also am operating on very little sleep, so if I can manage to get all these numbers out to you, it will be a bit of a miracle. So this story of women in politics in this cycle has really been front and center, and there has been a lot of talk about the Year of the Woman, which is a label that I loathe. It makes women seem like a novelty. It makes them seem like the other. Women are citizens in this country who run for office more and more, and we would like to just see this normalized and stop having it labeled in quite that way. It also sets an expectation that somehow in 1 year, which we will get a year, that in 1 year the problem of women's underrepresentation in politics will get solved. That's not the case. It was not the case yesterday, although advances were made. We did see record numbers of women candidates at every level of office, and those record numbers of candidates yield some records. So I'm just going to go through some of the outcomes for women in this cycle and understand that a lot of these are still moving targets. We have a lot of races that involve women that are still too close to call. So we did, in fact, elect a record number of women to the House. There are 95 women now who've been elected. Right now, we have 84 who are currently serving. We're up to 95. There are at least 4 women versus women races that are outstanding, so we will get to 99. That 99, by the way, gets us from 19.3% in the House to 23% in the House. So you see when I say that we've made some gains, we're not talking about doubling the number of women in Congress by any stretch. Right now, without the 95 that are confirmed that we know of, 83 Democrats and 12 Republicans. Right now, currently serving, there are 61 Democrats and 23 Republicans. This is a constant issue for us as we look at the goal of achieving political parity for women when we see this kind of partisan disparity. We are not going to get to 50% women in Congress if only one party is electing women. And Republican women, while they may pick up a little bit in the Senate, overall are going to lose, I think, significant ground in Congress. So we have to be watching that. We also are seeing some important records set for women of color in the House. We will have at least 40 women of color in the House as a result of this election. All of them right now are Democrats. We are still waiting on calls for a race of an incumbent in Washington State, Jamie Herrera Butler, who we expect will win, who is Latina. Young Kim, who may be a newly elected woman in California, we expect her to win. She would actually be the first Korean-American woman elected to Congress. And Mia Love, who is the first and only Black Republican woman elected to Congress from Utah, is in trouble in Utah, and her race is too close to call, but we're likely to lose her. In the Senate, it's going to be pretty much a wash. We lost 2 Democratic women in the Senate, Heidi Heitkamp and Claire McCaskill. We picked up 1 Democrat, Jackie Rosen in Nevada, and 1 Republican, Marsha Blackburn in Tennessee. There is a too close to call race in Arizona between Martha McSally and Kristen Sinema. We don't know what that outcome will be. And then we have our favorite thing at the Center for American Women in Politics, a runoff, which just prolongs the agony of our numbers. Cindy Hyde-Smith in Mississippi is going to be in a runoff. So we could end up with either 23, which is where we are right now, so status quo, maybe 24 if Cindy Hyde-Smith wins that runoff. For governors, the record number of women ever to serve as governor is 9. That happened in 2004 and 2007. We currently only have 6 women governors. We will be matching that record 9, but not breaking that record 9, unless Stacey Abrams pulls out that race in Georgia. That would get us to 10. Right now, we had 4 incumbent women who won in Oregon, Rhode Island, Alabama, and Iowa, and we have the remaining 5 women who are newly elected in South Dakota, Maine, Kansas, Michigan, and New Mexico. And South Dakota and Maine, that's the first time a woman has been elected governor from those states. Michelle Lujan Grisham, who was elected in New Mexico, will be the only woman of color serving as a governor. She is the first Democratic woman of color ever elected governor. We've had 2 women of color who have served in the past. Both have been Republicans. There's also been a bit of a shift here in partisan breakdown. So we have 3 Republicans and 6 Democrats. At the executive level for governor, that has been the one place where Republican women have done a bit better than Democratic women. That is not the case right now. We also have a lot of significant and I think important firsts that we've been paying attention to over the course of this race. We see the first 2 Native American women ever to go to Congress. Deb Haaland in New Mexico, Sharice Davids in Kansas. We will see the first Muslim women elected to Congress, Rashid Tlaib in Michigan and Ilhan Omar in Minnesota. 4 states will be sending their very first women of color to Congress. That's in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Kansas. I think interestingly in Texas, where 40% of the population is Hispanic, the state of Texas has never sent a Latina to Congress. That will change with the election of Veronica Escobar and Sylvia Garcia. And as I said, Young Kim, if she is elected, would be the first Korean American woman. Another place we're paid a lot of attention to is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the largest state with no women in its congressional delegation right now. There are currently 11 states that hold that honor, but they have gone in one election cycle from 0 to 4. And I think that tells you the power of redistricting. There was the little glitch in Pennsylvania that meant that they had to do a last-minute redistricting that opened up opportunities. Women took advantage of those opportunities, and they ran and they won. This is important as we think about this movement looking to the future in 2022. So we saw record numbers of women running for the state legislature this time. We're hoping that redistricting as a result of the 2020 census will bring some more open seats and increase opportunities for women in 2022. So I will stop there.
Okay.
And I got all those words out.
Thank you.
Well done. The most depressing thing I learned is, Herb, your career has really gone downhill. The Target, and now covering DC. It's pretty, pretty sad.
I think Targum is more financially helpful.
I think that's you're right.
But that's only because all the students are required to pay for a
There
subscription.
you go. Well, the thing that I learned yesterday, again, and this is something that was reinforced to me with the results yesterday, is that New Jersey just does not vote Republican on the federal level. And every time we have a candidate who tries on the Republican side, it's almost like Lucy with the football, where they just pull it out from the Republicans at the last minute. What was striking to me, and looking at the numbers this morning, is that Steve Lonegan, who was not the most well-financed or popular candidate in the world, got exactly the same amount percentage-wise against Cory Booker as Bob Hugin, who's going to be on track to spend over $40 million, got against Bob Menendez. And that just says to me that this is not a state, at least in my lifetime, that has ever or continues to ever want to send Republicans to the House or the Senate, or especially the Senate. Having said that, it's not a Republican, it's not a Democratic state on the state level. Certainly we saw 2 terms of Chris Christie, and Democrats are not necessarily shoo-ins on the state level, but they certainly are on the federal level. The other thing that I thought was interesting was we had talked about the suburban wave throughout this election cycle, and we really saw that reflected very much in New Jersey. Mikey Sherrill won Morris County, which is, the archetypal Republican county to me, but I think 12,000, I mean, some crazy number.
It was 9 points.
9 points, right. I think it was over 10,000 votes. And in fact, Bob Menendez got in Essex County alone what Bob Hugin got in Morris, Monmouth, and Ocean counties combined, which is exactly the opposite of what Chris Christie did when he ran, which is, I believe, he got in Monmouth or Ocean, something.
Ocean and Monmouth.
Ocean, right.
Yeah, the new paradigm is Ocean
right.
and Monmouth outdoing Essex and Hudson.
Hudson, right, and now this was completely the reverse. Look, I ran the super PAC for Bob Menendez. We had an internal poll showing him up by 2 10 days ago, and I was completely convinced that that was going to be the case. He was going to eke it out, but Mike and I had an offline conversation a couple of days ago where I expressed to you how nervous I was. And it turns out that he killed, and he killed, I think, primarily on the strength of suburban voters coming out, urban voters coming out certainly, but you have suburban voters coming out in counties like Morris, Somerset, which used to be bastions of republicanism, that he won. I think he's the first Democrat to lose in a primary in Somerset County and win in a general election. This is a state that I think more and more in the federal level is trending Democratic for that reason. And it's incredible to see Mikey Sherrill, Tom Malinowski, potentially Andy Kim, one, and this is to Mike's credit, one under a map that was created by Republicans. I mean, you guys did a very good job in redistricting, in creating.
It was really good for like, it was really good for like 8 years.
But yeah, I mean, and that was actually, I compliment Mike because he led the effort on that. And to have Democrats win so overwhelmingly in a map that was created for Republicans says to me two things. One is, that's great for Democrats, and the other hand, when redistricting comes up again for Democrats in a few cycles, we will be cannibalizing each other because suddenly we're not going to be creating safe seats for the incumbent Republicans. We'll have to create safe seats for ourselves, which will be much more complicated by the fact that we'll have to be competing with each other for those Democratic districts. So Donald Trump is the gift that keeps on giving here in New Jersey. He is not the gift that keeps on giving to Democrats around the country, however, and I was a little despondent yesterday in looking at the numbers across the country, because to me, it is just such a bifurcation between what we on the coast think and feel and what people across the country feel. I'm 45 years old, I've never in my life seen a country so divided. It seems to me that we're not even debating the same issues anymore, we're not even talking the same language. Where facts are not being debated, we're actually not even on the same paradigm. And as popular as Trump was, and continues to be in the center of the country, and not just the center of the country, but in places like Florida, is as unpopular as he is around here and in California. And to me, that doesn't bode well for how people work together going forward. There was no mandate for either side. The president, I saw, took incredible credit this morning for a resounding victory, which is great. But by the way, ironically enough, he probably should in some, we laugh about it, but the Senate was a resounding victory for him. His party was able to knock off incumbents that were vulnerable, but should have won in a year like this. There certainly wasn't the blue tsunami that people anticipated having. The House did well, and we're on track to probably, as Democrats, pick up about 10 to maybe 15 seats, but that's nothing compared to what I think we had anticipated. For all that some of us rolled our eyes when he went down to the border and started talking about immigration and started talking about caravans, it's effective. And I think, I forgot who made this point, I think it was you, Michael, but whoever, he knows exactly which buttons to push for his base, and as much as we think his base is limited to older, whiter, non-college educated voters or rural voters, they were able to swing a lot of states on the state level and knock off a lot of incumbents like Claire McCaskill, who'd been around for a while, and Heidi Heitkamp and certainly others. So from that perspective, this is certainly not a mandate for the Democrats. It's certainly not a mandate for Republicans. Herb, you're going to have a lot to cover because I don't even know where, as you said, where we go from here after that.
I think Bill Pascrell asked for Trump's tax return.
I think Bill, yeah, and by the way, and by the way, Trump has said they can ask and they can do whatever they want. I'm going to do whatever I want. I mean,
He doesn't ask for them from Trump.
Right.
He asked for them from the IRS.
The IRS, which is controlled by Trump. So, look, at the end of the day, what we're going to be ending up with is more polarization, more of the same, and how this shakes out in 2020 is anybody's guess. But I judging by what we just saw in the last 24 hours, I'm not so sure that it is going to be resolved in 2020 with either the win or the loss of the president. Which leads me to say to all of you who are in college now, I'm so sorry, but you're about to enter political life, at least in my experience, at a time that has never been more divided. And I unfortunately don't see really this ray of light where things will shake out and there's going to be this great awakening by either side that's going to suddenly realign the paradigm for either side. So I know a lot of Republicans who privately said they wished that Republicans would get a massive spanking so the party can go back to focusing on core issues that they had always focused on. That didn't happen either. And so for that reason, I think the Republican Party continues to be the party of Trump. You had moderates like Leonard Lance losing. And so the ones who did win are going to be more aligned with the president. And Democrats will do what they do best, which is, complain and hold hearings and and hope for Robert Mueller to come through, but that's, you know, that's not getting us to a point where we have a functional government, unfortunately. So I wish I could be more optimistic based on yesterday, but I did not wake up this morning on the little sleep I had, and maybe if I had more sleep, I'd feel better, thinking this was a great night for either party, or for democracy in general.
Thanks.
Well, as a Republican who runs races. And your lack of optimism. Congratulations on your lack of optimism.
Thank you for stepping my applause line.
As a Republican who runs races in the Northeast, you're trained to find silver linings and look for the good and find some council race you won somewhere and say that portends well for the future. I would say you look at this in two ways as a Republican. One is looking at it in New Jersey, and then two would be looking at it federally. And they are two different stories. As Julie said, I will start on the federal side. If you look at what happened to President Obama in his first midterm or President Clinton in his first midterm, they were drubbings across the board. That did not happen yesterday nationally. Yes, Democrats retook the House. They did not come near the number of seats that Republicans took in 2010 or Republicans took in 1994. And they have a smaller majority, which means people like Tom Malinowski and Mikey Sherrill are going to be forced to take some tough votes, like on who's going to be the speaker and things like that they campaign very Republican light in some ways on some of those things. We'll see how they vote. And certainly picking up seats in the Senate is a big deal, and nobody should discount that. That doesn't normally happen in midterm. Now, the map was very much in favor, right? There were a lot of those Democrats were in those rectangular states in the middle of the country, and Trump is very popular there. He put those states on the map. We didn't win those under George W. Bush or when John McCain or Mitt Romney were running, but they did win while Donald Trump was president. And I think you have to give some credit there. He knows what buttons to push. And as Julie said, whether you think there's a disconnect or not, the reality is Republicans could be at 55 in the Senate when this is done. Going from 51 to 55, that is no small feat on the federal level. And as Herb said, judicial nominations, things of that nature matter a lot to conservatives, matter a lot to whoever the president, whichever party it is, to get those through. And so that's obviously a big deal. On a state level, it was a bloodbath for Republicans, and people shouldn't pretend otherwise. Right now, the MacArthur-Kim race is neck and neck, and votes are still to be counted. I hold out, obviously, optimism that MacArthur will hold on, but it could go the other way. Clearly, looking at where the numbers are out, it's going to be like this. If he were to lose, Republicans will have one seat in the House in New Jersey. The last time we did that was on Woodrow Wilson's coattails. That's literally the last time Republicans had one seat in the House. So if anybody thinks like this is some sort of like, well, it just happens. This is not. Leonard Lance is a great public servant and has been for decades. Tom MacArthur's done a great job. Losing Rodney and Frank Lobiando, bad for the state. So I don't think it's good for the state to have one-party control. But also, 2 years ago, essentially right before the 2016 election, it was a 6-6 in New Jersey, and to go from 6-6 to 11-1 in 2 years. It's a backlash to the president. There's no two ways about it. Republicans should not rationalize anything else. We're losing a seat in Somerset County, losing seats in Burlington County to a guy who basically dropped out of the race because of police issues that he'd had, and he still won. I mean, this was not because of local races. This was not because Leonard Lance wasn't doing a good job, or the freeholders in Burlington weren't doing a good job. It had nothing to do with them. We lost towns that we never lose, and it really, I feel bad for the local candidates who were swept up in it. So Republicans in New Jersey have to look up and say that the nationalized message that was coming out in the last 10 days, and you saw the shift in all the polling, the Senate polling, the House polling, was shifting away as it was shifting in favor in some of the Senate states where Republicans were trying to play, Indiana, places like that. The message, the national message, certainly helped Republicans in North Dakota and Indiana and states like that, Montana. Obviously didn't help here. So I think as Republicans here, we have to look up and say, like, we're going to need to, as much as you can, carve your own image. It's very hard of either party. The president is the image of the party. Whether you agree or not, that's the reality. No matter who the president is, no matter which party it is, that is what voters see as that party's image. So it's going to be difficult. The final thing I'll say is that we lost moderates, and we lost moderates in both parties. Leonard Lance, Rodney Frelinghuysen, Frank Lobiando, moderate Republicans, Carlos Curbelo in Florida, somebody who really stood up when thought Trump was wrong, especially on immigration, Hispanic Republican. We lost him. We lost folks in suburban Chicago. I mean, those are moderates who lost. John Tester loses. John Tester, the senator from Montana, loses. Joe Donnelly, the Democrat senator from Indiana. The moderates are losing, and I don't know that's good. As a Republican in New Jersey, that's how we end up having some level of success. And then the final thing I'll say, just to Julie's point on the federal races in New Jersey, on the Senate race, obviously Democrats did a great job getting out the vote in Essex and Hudson. When Christie won, it was a kind of a new paradigm. Ocean and Monmouth, even though Monmouth has more registered Democrats than Republicans, there's a lot of independents, a lot of working class Democrats that vote Republican. Ocean and Monmouth had a greater margin of victory than Essex and Hudson. And so that's what Republicans have since tried to repeat. It's like an easy formula to explain, very, very difficult to actually execute. But the Essex and Hudson numbers were enormous, and the numbers in Ocean were very good, and Monmouth were good, but not where they needed to be. But if you look back on races in New Jersey since 2000, and you take Christie out, this is the number Republicans get. Schundler, 42%. Forrester, 43% for governor. Kim Guadagno, 42%. In Senate races, Bob Franks got 47. 44 for Forrester, 44 for Kane, 42 for Zimmer, 39 for Carrillos, 44 for Lonigan, 42 for Bell, 44. Presidential races, 40, 46, 41, 40, 41. And Republicans are mired basically in the low 40s. And it takes an extraordinary, I think, Republican to get out of it. You need a good political climate. You need a flawed Democrat. You need all these things to come together for Republicans to win. And I agree with Julie. On the federal side, it is clear that New Jersey voters are uncomfortable on the federal side with having Republicans in the Senate. Listen, once the Democrats mess up Trenton enough, they're willing to give us a shot, and that'll happen. It keeps happening. It's a cycle that we keep seeing, right? And Republicans, we count on that, so keep going. But I think we have to. This is like a moment where you have to take a step back as Republicans and say, in New Jersey at least, there's a moment to start fresh a little bit. Hopefully focus on Trenton a little bit after this is over. I mean, take the focus off of some of the federal races, back onto state races next year. That will be some level of success for us to start a climb back.
Let me ask about the anti-politician fervor in the country. And certainly in New Jersey, if of the 4 districts where Democrats either picked up a seat or may pick up a seat, only Van Drew was a legislator. The other 3 were all running for office for the first time. And going back, I mean, MacArthur ran for office the first time and when he came into Congress. I wonder, in your sense of other states, whether legislators, council members, freehold, they don't have freeholders, but whatever, people who'd had elective office were successful in moving up to the House or maybe the Senate, or whether the public really is clamoring for non-politicians to do the work of being a politician.
Well, I think among the women candidates, one of the things that we did see this year was a lot of women who are running for the first time. They were coming from places that we haven't seen a lot of women before, women veterans, as exemplified by Mikey Sherrill. She is sort of the quintessential new woman candidate that we saw around the country. And I think that their running really came out of an exasperation of the result of the 2016 election, and wanting to have a voice, and wanting to figure out a way to have people in elective office that looked like them and sounded like them, and that they couldn't rely on somebody else to do that. They couldn't rely on the party to recruit somebody that looked like that. And a lot of them ran without being recruited, which is a bit of a different model for women, where women have much more likely been the candidate that has to get tapped by somebody, mostly the party, to make that decision to run, whereas men are what we call self-starters. That's the nice thing. We call them self-starters. As opposed to wake up one morning, look in the mirror, and say, I'd be a great elected official, and they just run for office. So I think we've certainly seen that model around the country, and you see it in many of the new women who were elected.
I would also note that, in the way this campaign was framed as an attack and fear campaign, having somebody who actually had a record gave you something to hit at, whereas you saw the stuff that they had to find against Malinowski and Kim. We didn't pay his property taxes 2 years ago, and he's not one of us. He only moved here. That kind of stuff is not as resonant in an election where people actually care. You actually, but if you have, I live in D.C., so I had to watch the ads against Barbara Comstock and by Jennifer Wexton in this suburban Virginia district just outside the district, just outside D.C. And, you know, they were attacking Jennifer Wexton for being the transportation commissioner for raising tolls. You know, that kind of stuff. You know, you actually get something meaty that people can register in their brains. Whereas if you run these tabula rasa candidates, they can say, oh, yeah, I'm not that way. I did, you know, there's no, yeah, but he voted
no
this time
record.
6 times
Right.
ago against the rule to change the, you know, motion to recommit, you know, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I agree. There's a great advantage, you said, as a not having a record is a huge advantage for running. But I would also say that, like, people are just fed up with Washington in both parties. Like, Donald Trump won because he was outside of Washington. He won the primary because everybody else was a politician, and then he was running against Hillary Clinton, which is the embodiment of the status quo in a lot of these states and how they looked at her. So I think we'd all agree 2018, at least for a big part of the country, was a change election. 2016 was a change election. 2012 was 2010 was a change election. 2008 was a change election. 2006 was a change election. We normally don't have this many change elections in a row. We have to look back. I mean, Congress one party had Congress for 40 years until 1994. We don't often have this many change elections over the course of a decade and a half. The electorate's mad. They're mad. Neither party's doing a good job. So you get a chance for a couple years, 2-4 years, then we'll throw you out too and try some new people. So I think people don't want career politicians. It has become. We talked a little bit about this before the panel with Debbie about Leonard Lance. You know, Balanowski ran it. Yes, I think everybody in this room would believe Leonard Lance is a great public servant, whether you agree with everything he's done in his life. He's been a great public servant who cares deeply about this state. Stood up to Christy Whitman in his own party when she thought she was wrong, and has done and tried to do the same throughout. But Tom Malinowski threw career politician at him, and part of what worked, because people don't like career politicians. They don't honor it the way maybe they used to, and until government really functions better, they're not going to.
But Mikey Sherrill, I think, is also a great example of people in a long line, at least here in New Jersey, of people who do well because they've got no public record.
Yep.
So Chris Christie was a great tabula rasa. I mean, he was a U.S. attorney when he ran. He really had no record to speak of that Democrats could have pointed to, short of his freeholder record for one term in Morris County, which is nothing. Phil Murphy, same thing, had never held elected office. Corzine. And somebody like Sherrill or Malinowski are great examples of that, too, where Bob Hugin had something to point to. It wasn't an elected record, but it was a record of him being a quote-unquote greedy CEO, which really tested off the charts. So it did. So, you know, part of that, I think, is as recruitment goes forward for both parties into next year for legislative candidates, and also into 2020 for federal candidates again, and also potentially into 2021 for governor. That really is the model that works well. I mean, it's to find a candidate who has no record that you could point to, like Jennifer Wexton raising tolls. Even somebody like Bob Hugin, who had a record of raising drug prices. Find somebody like Mikey Sherrill, who what could you really say about her? I mean, there's really nothing you could say about her. She was a veteran, and then she became an assistant U.S. attorney. Same thing with
Nancy Pelosi.
Nancy Pelosi,
Yeah.
but Nancy Pelosi is not the boogeyman in New Jersey that she may
Bob
be.
Menendez.
Okay, I mean, again, look at Bob Menendez's win. Bob Menendez, despite all of the negative ads run against him, and the last ad that was run against him was possibly the most negative ad I've ever seen, and that's saying a lot in the state, still won by over 10 points. I mean, that's pretty amazing considering how much he was outspent and what kind of baggage he had to carry. So to that end, that's because we were able to, not we, but the Menendez campaign and also our PAC to some extent was able to tie Hugin, not so much to Donald Trump, but to this whole greedy CEO mentality. So again, if you're looking forward and prospectively, I think it helps to be a Mikey Sherrill. I think it helps to be a Chris Christie. Somebody who really has no record that you can point to, good or bad.
But in Menendez's case, don't you think that because the congressional races were so contested in these different districts that it really benefited
Look at us.
Menendez?
I mean, look at Essex County, right? I mean, Leroy Jones, who's the chair of Essex County, the Democratic chair. Kevin McCabe here in Middlesex County, who's the Middlesex County Democratic chair. There were really no contested races there. Sherrill had a little piece of Essex in the west, but where he turned it out in Newark, in Irvington, in the Oranges, I mean, those were not contested congressional races. Here in Middlesex County, Frank Pallone and Bonnie Watson-Coleman didn't have a contested race at all. And yet Middlesex County, I think, got something like 250,000 votes, where last year, I think it was like 180. I mean, it just completely blew away even the governor in terms of turnout. So I don't know if that's so much as a reverse coattail thing versus a just this energy that people had towards sending Donald Trump a message all across the state.
I will say on turnout, we don't have the final numbers in, but there was a reversal in turnout and enthusiasm, which is a good sign, I think, all around. You did see it on the Republican side, too. You saw Ocean County with very high turnout, much higher than had been projected by some of the campaigns there. It was across the board, but we've been going down in this state since basically 2001 in turnout. If you look at governor's races, they've gone down every single year from turnout, from 2005 to 9 to 13 to 17, lower, lower, lower. Same with midterms. 2006 was higher than 2010, which was higher than 2014. I think we'll be back to 2006 or probably even higher levels in New Jersey once everything's counted.
It seemed that polling, despite all its problems of cell phones and people not answering calls and all that, did fairly well. That, I mean, I'm Julie, with the exception of your internal poll
Right.
a couple of days ago, but that, the outcomes seemed pretty close to what polls were predicting. even
I'd say
if-
other people's internals were similar. I would
Yeah.
say. There was a break there at the end.
I think it was an enthusiasm and a field effort that was much stronger than polling anticipated. I can tell you it's not just our poll, internal polls for Senator Schumer's PAC also had him, I think, up by 6 maybe. So certainly not what he got. Polling, I think, is able to predict sentiment. I'm not sure it can predict turnout. The turnout model is effectively as it should. Sometimes it does, but in this case, I didn't see anybody predicting. Well, I shouldn't say that. Quinnipiac certainly did. And I think others may have as well, but certainly not the internals that I saw on either side. And I think the internals that you had also probably didn't
And
count for it.
don't forget, and John, you know this, but I don't know how many other people think, polls are only good when they're taken. You did a poll 10 days ago, but that was before Senate Majority PAC was up to $7 million of ads that say Bob Menendez could be the decision between Trump having control of the Senate.
Well, that's why. I mean, that's why they poured the money was
understand that,
because of our
but-
poll.
But that may have changed
Right.
where things
Right.
were.
Right.
Flip side, polls were showing that Bill Nelson and Andrew Gillum were up in Florida. Trump made 2 trips to Florida in the final weekend. And what happened? DeSantis and Rick Scott are narrowly ahead. I mean, the president can take some credit for that possibly being his doing, and that doesn't mean that the poll was wrong when it was taken last Thursday.
You make a great point. I think political campaigns don't take polls to figure out where you are. They take polls to figure out how do you change where things are. And so most political campaigns actually don't poll in the last week or 10 days because you've made all your final decisions. To your point, Herb, you go in, you see what the polls are, and then you try to change them. And that happened, I think, in a few of these races.
But Florida, they were pretty close. I mean, it didn't go ultimately in that direction,
Right.
but within the margin of error, those
Well, I mean,
polls in
Quinnipiac
Florida
had
were.
Nelson up by 7 on Monday.
Okay, because I was
Yeah.
looking at the CNN poll had them really, really close.
Yes, but we have a question that came in from someone watching online about, actually 2 people, about redistricting. And these elections in some state, not particularly in New Jersey, but in other states, will have a significant impact on redistricting in 2020. The one I'm aware of is Maryland having a Republican governor, where the governor of Maryland has a lot of power over districts. Are there other states where any of you are aware that this is going to be significant, of a governor of one party or the other changing who's going to have an impact?
So one nearby is New York. Republicans losing control of the state senate in New York will have an impact on redistricting. In most states, the congressional or legislative map goes through like a piece of legislation. So whichever party has the power can basically draw the map, and unless there's an extreme case like in Pennsylvania where the court had to step in, it just goes through like a piece of legislation. So if you have divided government like in Maryland, you'll probably have some sort of compromise to get the map. New Jersey actually I think is one of the better processes where it's forced to be bipartisan on both sides. One of my favorite pieces on that was when Democrats controlled the legislature. It was Bob Franks, who was someone I worked for, who as a legislator introduced, it used to be that the partisan legislature got to decide. And so with Bob, when he was in the minority, introduced this to make it nonpartisan. Republicans then win back the majority. In the lame duck, the Democrats pass his bill to make it so that it's nonpartisan before the Republicans take control. Republicans never switched it back. But I think New Jersey actually has a pretty good process. And it was 6-6 a few years ago. New Jersey has an independent tiebreaker that's usually agreed to by the parties or appointed by the state Supreme Court, which I think is probably a better process. And it's more like a mediation process than it is in other states.
Yeah, but don't forget, you also have a census that's being conducted right now that Democrats think is inherently irresponsible and is doing everything it can to suppress minority voters or voters for people of color. So before we even get to redistricting, let's talk about the fact that there's a lawsuit coming to sue the Commerce Committee, Wilbur Ross, who I'm not sure is fully functioning or aware that this is happening. But that will be a predicate for what we see with redistricting around the country, and I think that's something that people who are politically minded really need to pay attention to. That is a huge red flag in terms of what redistricting will look like, regardless of whether legislatures vote the way they vote, because if you don't count people, you're not going to get the districts that you need.
Herb, let me ask, Mike mentions lame duck. Now, I assume there'll be a lame duck session of Congress.
Oh, yeah, they're back on
now.
Monday.
And is there a sense of what priorities will be for the weeks that there is still a Republican House as well as a Republican Senate?
Well, about a quarter of the federal budget still hasn't been passed. We're on a temporary budget. So that's Homeland Security, Transportation, I forget which other departments they've got to fund. That's where the showdown comes on the wall. And the president wanting the money appropriated, whereas Democrats might agree to authorize the money, but then it won't be appropriated for years out. Because frankly, you can't really spend $30 billion in 12 months. I mean, I could, but I'd buy a newspaper, right?
There's still some money left over.
It would go quickly. But we also have, I'm wondering whether or not they try to do things to, tighten down investigations. It's Wednesday, right? Where's Mueller? We're all expecting somebody. I mean, has anybody been indicted this morning? We're expecting some of those things, and will there be a backlash in the Republican-controlled House before they leave? We're going to have to watch that. And then, of course, I mean, it's not the lame duck, but Democrats have to come in and pick a leader. That's the one that's going to be, late. I mean, I guess it's the week after Thanksgiving. If I remember where they said they were going to have their meeting, they have to figure out who gets to vote because they have to settle some of these races. But, how do they deal with the number of Democrats, new Democrats, who said, I won't vote for Nancy Pelosi?
By not having anybody run against her.
Right.
There are people running against her.
Okay.
But then they will have to vote in the House, though. It's one thing to not vote in caucus, they'll have to vote in the House, and then she has to get a majority of votes on the floor to become Speaker.
Other questions from people here? Students first. Any students? Yes. And please identify yourself and where you're from.
Hello, my name is Navruz. I'm a student here at Rutgers. I'm studying mechanical engineering. And I was wondering what your all take is on the Republican gains in the Senate and what that means for the battle for the Senate majority in 2020.
I think it's going to make it difficult. I've done a couple stints at the Senate committee, and the map is favorable. What's that? I'm sorry. The map favors Democrats in the next election. Just basically, you have to go back 6 or 12 years to kind of figure out why the map is where it is. It was really good for Republicans this year because it was really predicated on the 2006 election, which was a very good year for Democrats, winning in states they shouldn't have. If you look at what's coming up in 2020, it's predicated on the 2014 map, which is a very good year for Republicans. So Republicans are defending a lot more turf. If they get to 55, though, which is kind of where it's trending, basis 3 races too close to call, there'll be a runoff. So 51 now, but they could be 55 when it's all said and done. I think it's going to be, I think the Democrats had like a 2-year plan or a 2-cycle plan to really keep it close this year and then win it. I think it's going to be a lot harder. If they're going to have a net of +6 next time around, it's going to be difficult. But a lot of that will depend on the top of the ticket and who's running against Trump. But I think that's been made more difficult based on the results of last night.
I did not think the first question about 2020 would be about Senate campaigns.
It's a very, very good students here.
Right, yes. Jeff.
Jeff Laurenti from Trenton. First, a very brief observation, and that is that the nominations for Congress tend to be open to outsiders when their party is not in control in the district, but the party organizations control the nomination. So you get a Jay Weber running in the Morris County district because the party's still strong, but we have the Malinowskis and all these national types who are able to get a nomination when it's a hopeless district normally. My question goes to what kind of legislative program the president may have now that he faces a Democratic House. 8 years ago, when Obama lost control of the House, Suddenly, there was no money for economic stimulus. The economic recovery was going to stall. You could no longer get a legislative agenda passed, and for Democrats, that was a big problem. Does Trump have a legislative agenda that it matters whether or not they have Republicans or Republican sympathetic Democrats with them in control of the House? Is this going to be a legislative blockade of some sort, or for the president, it really doesn't matter?
I think there's two ways to go. One is the way President Obama and Republicans at that time, Boehner, went. There was zero relationship before Republicans took the House. John Boehner had never been to the White House, had never been on Air Force One before Republicans took the House. He had no desire to work with him, especially with the new members that ever came in. The opposite was Bill Clinton in 1994. He and Newt Gingrich, for as much as they sparred with each other, were both like very smart policy wonks. And they got together on a few things, and Bill Clinton smartly worked with Gingrich on some things that seemed centrist, like school uniforms and some welfare reforms. And then in the campaign, used him as a foil. Remember, Dole Gingrich were tied together. I don't know that you will see that type of spirit on either side of the aisle, quite frankly. I don't know that Democrats want to see it. I think Democrats might rather see subpoenas and impeachment rather than an infrastructure bill pass. I'll leave it to Julie to say whether that's true. I think if smart politics on both sides would be something like an infrastructure bill. Donald Trump got lots of votes from labor union members, if not support from labor union heads. An infrastructure bill is something that moderate Democrats and Republicans could support, would be good for the president in terms of labor support, things that would shore up, that actually expand his base. One thing he hasn't really done, as much as he solidified his base, he hasn't really expanded it. Most people who win with a minority of the vote then spend time expanding. He hasn't done that. That's something that could be done. That's something I thought might be done in the first term. It hasn't happened. So we'll see if there was I don't know if there's a willingness on the Democrat side or on Trump's side for that matter, but that's something that I would look to as a potential legislative piece.
So I spent 13 years at Fox News, so I can read Donald Trump's mind really well. And I can tell you that I'm not so sure that he's interested in actually getting anything done. And to a point that Herb raised, he would be perfectly fine, I think, with having the money for the wall authorized, but never appropriated, because then he can go to his base and say, hey, I got them to agree to build the wall, and the wall is being built, and there'll be a little chain link fence put up, and he'll say the wall is being built, and Fox will say, yes, look at this wall being built, and he and Sean Hannity will high-five each other, and I'm not trying to be funny, I mean, this literally is what happens. And then he runs on that, the base is happy, and he's gonna tell people he's getting stuff done. In terms of really getting anything done, I don't know that he's got, it's not even a spirit, I don't know that he or anybody around him, with a few exceptions, have the capacity to engage in what Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton engaged in. These are both policy wonks. I may not have agreed with Newt Gingrich, but I certainly respect his acumen, and Bill Clinton was an incredible policy wonk. I don't see that from this president. And so to that point, I don't necessarily think that he's interested in anything more than having sound bites at rallies or having his talking points parroted back to him by media that he agrees with. To get, I mean, he doesn't really, success for him is not getting something tangible done. Success for him is saying that he's getting something tangible done. And that's not, I'm actually not trying to be humorous about this. I think this is actually the case. And so I don't think that anything's going to get done, unfortunately, and I don't think it's in Democrats' interest to get anything done, because working with Donald Trump does not energize the Democratic base that much. Look, we'd all love an infrastructure bill. Those of us who commute to New Jersey or from New Jersey know that we need this ARC tunnel desperately built, for example. As Herb said, the wall for the tunnel. I don't see that happening. I don't see that president that wants to reward New Jersey or New York, and I don't see Democrats that want to reward the president by building a wall that is a huge waste of money in their estimation, that does nothing other than get him to run up the scoreboard on his side. That's
I
not
would throw two things on. One is the president in his rallies in the last couple of weeks was saying Democrats are blocking immigration reform, when in fact there was a compromised Senate bill to deal with DACA that he lobbied, his administration, after agreeing to it, lobbied members to defeat in the Senate. Now he's actually going to have a Democratic House to blame for things. This will make him happy. It will be an angry Democratic House that thinks it's doing what they were just sent here to do. They were sent here to do, which is provide oversight, and he will make them look like insane, lawyers with paper. But to disagree with one of the premises in the beginning of your question, Jay Weber was not picked by the county organizations to run for that seat. County organizations actually went out and recruited somebody else to run in that primary who lost. And then somebody else, another group of people who didn't like Jay Weber as a candidate, recruited somebody else to run against. So you had a three-way primary, which Weber, having actually run in elections, having people, at county and municipal levels that he could go talk to, won. And, Mike, you may know more about how the dynamic of that primary played out, but it was not the county organizations or the state organizations that we need to get somebody good for Rodney's seat. Now, on the Democratic side, the DCCC did have its thumb on the scale, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. They wanted Malinowski in the 7th. They got Malinowski in 7th. In the 11th, I actually moderated a candidates forum a week after Thanksgiving in 2017. So let's think about this. Just under 2 years away from the election, there were 12 people in a church in Morristown, I think it was, who were talking about running against Rodney Frelinghuysen. They wanted to, seize on the, resist movement, and the grassroots groups wanted to hear from all of them before the county bosses picked somebody. And that's what that forum was basically designed to do. Congressman Frelinghuysen was invited to. He chose not to attend. I don't disagree with him. But, that was a case where the counties liked Cheryl because she looked like she could do the job. But, it was actually a bubble up rather than a push down kind of thing.
That's right.
So based on that, you may be brought in to chair a panel of the Democrats running for president in a couple of weeks, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Are there more student questions? Good.
Hi, my name is Alex Anderson. I'm a public policy and an environmental science student, and I was wondering if there were any comments on possible Russian election meddling this midterm election.
Ooh, my favorite topic. Dana Rohrabacher-Lusk. We just Vladimir Putin's favorite congressman. The answer is we don't know until Robert Mueller is done with his investigation. And as Donald Trump points out, anybody who's gotten indicted so far has not been tied to, except for the Russians that actually got indicted, but nobody in his campaign got indicted for Russian meddling in the election or collusion, as he says. We'll see what happens with Mueller, and I think Democrats would be wise to wait for Mueller to complete his investigation, although the president will discredit that no matter what happens, than to start impeachment hearings or hearings of their own. We saw Devin Nunes, who's the House Intelligence Committee chair, really do everything he could to suppress any kind of investigation into this. And I think Democrats would be wise not to repeat his mistake and meddle in it until Robert Mueller is done with what he's trying to do.
I would just make one comment on the Russian interference. I think people, and I think both Republicans and Democrats, conflate the argument of Russian meddling and the outcome of the election. I think Donald Trump is so opposed to the Russian meddling because he thinks that somehow means he didn't win it legitimately. And I think Democrats look at Russian meddling and say, oh my God, that's the only reason we lost. Hillary Clinton's campaign committed political malpractice. That is why she lost. She did not campaign in Wisconsin once. Wisconsin, which was basically a tie in 2004 and has been very close and had Republican governor and Republican legislature, for some reason they thought was in the bag. Detroit, Michigan, they weren't campaigning in Detroit. You had unions going there saying we have to do this, and they were saying no, it's fine, we need to run up the score. She was campaigning in Georgia and Arizona, states she didn't need to win. Never forget, both things are true. Russians meddled, they tried. That was not the reason, I don't believe, for the outcome of the election. Hillary Clinton's campaign still should have won that election, and I think everyone on both sides has done a disservice to this argument by not acknowledging those two factors.
But also keep in mind what the Russians were trying to do. They were trying to set us against each other, and there's nothing in last night's results that tell me that they didn't continue to win on that score.
Yeah, good point.
Yep.
Questions?
Hi everyone, my name is Amin Khalili. I'm a PhD student from biomedical engineering. I have a question about the House, what is going to happen. I saw that President Trump tweeted earlier that if Nancy Pelosi doesn't become Speaker, we'll throw in some Republican votes to get her to become Speaker. So that sounds to me looks like an olive branch. Also, Before that, he said
No.
before that, he tweeted.
You need to hang out with passive-aggressive people.
Before that, he tweeted that if Democrats start investigating Republicans, the Republicans will start investigating Democrats. So what do you think will happen in the House now that we have the majority?
I'll say this. I would certainly like to see the first, the second, the third, or fourth Republican in the House who votes for Nancy Pelosi to become majority. I think that person could basically say, it's career suicide, my career is over, and I'm not running for re-election in 2020.
I would also like to see the end of the demonization of Nancy Pelosi. The idea that when women reach a certain age, they expire, as opposed to men who, when they reach a certain age, have experience. And I am, this ongoing, when you watched those ads that the Republicans ran all over the country, where they talked more about Nancy Pelosi than they did about the actual candidate they were running against, there are reasons for her, there are reasons against her, but there is a gendered component to this. We saw it with Hillary Clinton. She's a bit off the stage, not completely, but now Nancy Pelosi continues to be the person who gets demonized, and I'm tired of it.
Amen.
I'll just say this, she's the most unpopular Democrat in America, and that's why there may
Not
be a
among
gender-
Democrats, though. If
there
you
may
looked
be-
at that exit
But
poll
the elections
last
aren't held
night.
among Democrats. But like your point about why run against Nancy Pelosi, Bob Menendez ran against Donald Trump. He didn't run against Bob Hugin. He ran against every Democrat in America ran against Donald Trump. You run against what embodies the party. So there may be a gender component to it, but I don't think it's because of her gender that they pick out Nancy Pelosi. If you poll, she's unpopular in Republican districts more so than most of the candidates that are running, or Cory Booker or any other Democrat you want to pick.
But I think, I'm going to stand up for my fellow women here. I think there is a expectation, and Hillary Clinton's a great example of people saying about her, get off the stage, get off the stage. I know your question was not about Hillary, but get off the stage, your time has passed. Mitt Romney is now a senator. Nobody told him to get off the stage when he lost his election. John McCain, nobody told him to get off the stage. He went right back to the Senate. And I could keep going. George Herbert Bush, nobody told him to get off the stage. And in fact, his son then came back and ran for president. So meanwhile, Hillary continues to be marginalized. And I think there is definitely a gender component to it. Look, there's no two ways about it. Every man that has preceded her has been given and afforded every opportunity to come back from the abyss. She's the only one that people get shoved off to. And I think there is a gender component. You're absolutely right, Mike. Nancy Pelosi is incredibly unpopular, the same way that Newt Gingrich was. This is not a boogeyman woman thing. But there is an expectation about Nancy Pelosi being too old. She's around the same age as the president, by the way. I mean, maybe a year or two older. But nobody's talking about him being too old and getting off the stage. And I think that is a gender difference.
I would also just point out, she's about to become Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's not overreact to like how bad it is for Nancy Pelosi, right? She's about to become the second Speaker of the House after she was the first female Speaker of the House.
With Republican votes, apparently.
I would say
By acclamation.
and I would say I think as Republicans in New Jersey too, we have such great diversity in New Jersey, and I came of age politically with. Christy Whitman was my governor. Marge Rockwell was my congressman. My mother was my mayor. I came of age politically where it's just expected that women do this. And by the way, if you're going to be Speaker of the House, guess what? Republicans are going to take shots at you. That's the way it is, and it should be the way it should be regardless of gender.
But one of the things that's interesting to me is that while her name is thrown around, like it's
Ruth, you have a comment?
Yeah, like some deflated football or something like that. I mean, what is it that she supposedly has done that's made her public enemy number one, a pariah? I mean, what is it?
I'll tell you, it was a passage of Obamacare without any Republican votes. That's what it was. I mean, the Democrats made it. It was.
No, that's what I'm saying.
That's what it was. Does anybody think 2010 was not a reaction to Obamacare? And Nancy Pelosi ushered it through with Rahm Emanuel's help from the White House to get it through. 2010 was a backlash to that. I mean, that's what it was.
That law that all these Republicans promised to protect in this last campaign?
Wait.
After they repealed it 157 times?
I'm sorry, the president actually stood up yesterday or the day before and said, don't vote for the Democrats, they're going to repeal Obamacare. I mean, this is bizarre world. I think the word Schadenfreude is what went through my mind when I saw that. But
So she pushed through this historic legislation that so many people think is absolutely necessary in this country, and it was, and that was on the ballot too across the country. So she's demonized for supporting this legislation, advocating for this legislation. So many people say we need it, but she's a demon because she did that. I mean, where's the disconnect? What causes the disconnect? Do people not know that she did this or what?
Well, I don't think it has anything to do with policy. I mean, she's the foil to the president, and if you're the fan of the president, you don't want anybody questioning him. That you want them to do what he says because he promised, whatever motivated you to get behind him. He's going to say he can't do it because of her. So she's the foil.
But why not Chuck Schumer? And that's the part that I think is interesting to me. Why not Chuck Schumer? Chuck Schumer is as much of a foil in the Senate as she is in the House, and yet she's being villainized. And I have to say, and I don't use the sexism word lightly, but I have to say part of it, I think, is because she is a woman. So, that's my Ruth Mandel public PSA so that she doesn't have to say it.
More student.
Good morning. My name is Avinash. I'm a sophomore studying political science here at Rutgers. And my question is, so with the defeats of O'Rourke in Texas and Gillum in Florida, what does that leave Democratic presidential candidates for 2020? What's the field looking like now? And what are candidates really thinking? What's the new strategy that they have to approach with? Because the blue wave that was expected to come out maybe wasn't really as significant as was expected. So where does this leave the Democratic Party in 2020? And how can they avoid cannibalizing their own votes as what somewhat happened in the 2016 primaries?
You want to each mention your 5 favorite candidates? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, go Cory Booker, I have to say that. But look, the Democrats, I think, have a number of strong candidates, no more or less strong than the Republicans had in 2016. I mean, ultimately, Republicans cannibalized the hell out of each other. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had a challenge from Bernie Sanders, but otherwise was mainly coordinated. And yet Donald Trump is president. So I'm not so sure that a bloody primary is awful for the party. You have people like Sherrod Brown, who did incredibly well in a swing state in Ohio yesterday. You have Elizabeth Warren, who's a very high-profile woman. I mean, there are Kamala Harris. Beto O'Rourke, had he won, and I was never a true believer that he was going to win. I don't think Texas is quite there yet. Beto O'Rourke would have just been serving really, he would have had to start running for president immediately, and that would have been absurd. At least Obama stuck around for 4 years before he ran, or I should say before his election. So same thing with Gillum. There are people who've been amassing war chests and going to Iowa and going to New Hampshire for a number of years now, and I think that had Gillum or O'Rourke won, they would have really been behind the 8 ball. The time to have gotten in this race is now.
I think Beto could actually run now, but he wouldn't have if he won for that reason. He's got a following. He's got people who want to give him money. He's inspirational. I think but if he had gone to the Senate, he couldn't because the first forums are going to be in 6 months, like Herb said, first political forums.
I think what's interesting in Ohio, and Debbie, I know what you're about to say, is that Brown said to folks last night in winning re-election, more or less, pay attention to the base. And I think it's going to be interesting in 2020 to see who is the party nominee, the fight for the nomination. But I'll say this. The man who's in the Oval Office right now is powerful. I think there are people who are counting on Mueller to bring him down. The question has not been answered about whether he can, has it, Mike, about whether he can, quote, pardon himself or anything like that?
Why are you asking me? I'm not a legal scholar.
But I mean, and those types of things. And he is incredibly powerful in sending messages and dredging up issues, just as he did in this midterm election. You think that you're coasting to victory or doing whatever, and then here comes immigration, here comes something else, and it taps into people's emotions. It goes to the core of human beings and what some people think, and before you know it, he may win re-election.
I also just want to say that we may, for the first time, see multiple women on that stage when those debates go on during the primary on the Democratic side. So Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, but also from New York, Kirsten Gillibrand, who you have seen while she was campaigning for reelection, I kept seeing her in New Hampshire, and she has been amassing money and giving money to women candidates. She has a PAC called Off the Sidelines, and she's building a kind of team of women out there around the country who are big supporters of hers, and she supports them when they run. So I think all three of those are women to watch. And then Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota, I think wants it. I don't know if she's in a position to actually make that run, but I think she also wants it.
Has Elizabeth Warren damaged herself, though, with the whole genetic testing thing?
It's
And
kind of crazy.
I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have done that. That's playing right.
Yeah.
It's the same way Obama, I think, damaged and elevated Donald Trump by releasing his long-form birth certificate. You don't feed the You don't feed the animals at the zoo. You just make them crazier. I'm not comparing him to an animal. I don't want to hear the tweet. But you don't feed the crazy, right? You kind of let the troll go away.
I don't
Except on
think that
Twitter.
did her any good.
Question here. We're going to end this by 6 p.m., so I just want to
Hi, everybody. My name is John. I'm a fellow here at Eagleton. My question to you is, how do the bases of the Republican and GOP bases sift out through this election, where previously, maybe around the time of FDR, they were really shaken up, and Dems and Republicans had planks that maybe didn't necessarily coincide with each other, but now the Republicans have planks that don't interfere with each other's interests, like immigration, defense, things like that. There's no headbutting internally, whereas with the Democrats, you see different definitions of what civil rights are among LGBTQ people, amongst minority voters, amongst women, and then they can't all agree necessarily on how to come to these conclusions. So then when you see this infighting, I feel like the only time you really see a blue president has been someone who's been charismatic and can bring the base together through charismatic discourse, whereas you're not really getting anybody on the issues who's a Democrat. So how do you then reconcile that, trying to go forward with 2020 with the different bases and how they see their core issues?
I'm not sure that there is a Republican issue base. It's the party of Trump right now. I mean, you're either with him or you're against him, and you've got people like Christy Whitman, saying vote Democratic to spank them, who, grew up Republican to the point that she made stuff at scout camp for Dwight Eisenhower, So it's not clear to me that issues come into it at all on that side. And the Democrats are going to be fighting with themselves all the way through the convention over whose ascendancy is on the issues.
Bill Clinton had a great line. He said, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. And I think that's largely still true. We have a propensity to find, as you said, charismatic people like Bill Clinton, like Barack Obama, and that person is able to forge it. But Republicans also have done the same with Donald Trump. I mean, you had people who were never Trump people, Lindsey Graham, who now is his number one enabler. And I say that because he's really been able to transform the party. I'm not painting all Republicans with that brush. I would certainly never say that Mike DuHaime is a Donald Trump Republican. But I also would say that the way the party is structured right now, there's really no room for anybody but Donald Trump's worldview to be ascendant.
And they're actually waiting to find out what it is,
Right.
like on Twitter. I mean, we're doing this with trade. No, we're not. That kind of thing where he announces something and he's going to do an executive order and then it doesn't come. We were going to get the executive order on something last week. I think it was something to do with the border. I haven't seen it yet.
Birthright citizenship, right?
Yeah.
I think the struggle for a lot of Republicans is even somebody like Jeff Flake, right, who's very anti-Donald Trump, is actually far more conservative than Donald Trump. So I think you had a lot of people who were like anti-Trump, like wanting Jeff Flake to like stand up to Trump, but he was voting with Trump all the time. Guess what? Because 90% of what Trump did is actually, from a policy point of view, something Republicans support. Tax cuts, things of that nature, Republicans support. So I think the hard part for Republicans, how do you go completely against Trump when there actually are policy agreements? You're much more actually aligned with him from many policy perspectives. You might be offended by the immigration piece, but maybe you're not offended by the economic piece. And so for Democrats, maybe that's easier. It may become harder now when you have the House and you actually have some responsibility. Democrats easier. We're just against everything for Trump. I think Republicans have tried, in some cases unsuccessfully, to navigate. Like, I do agree with them on some spots and disagree with them on others. And I think the recipe for Republicans is to stand up and disagree when they disagree. And by the way, agree when you agree. And that's the way to do it. And in New Jersey, that's the way to do it. Like, when Chris Christie wins, it's because he's very Republican on some issues, and where he was against the Republicans, he was forcefully against. And I think that's when he took on John Boehner, for example, on Sandy funding. I think you have to do that. I think Republicans have had a really, really hard struggle kind of navigating that line because Trump is so powerful among the base and is so popular among the base.
And while we talked about Nancy Pelosi, the Republicans have to pick a leader, too, to succeed Paul Ryan. And they're going to be picking it from a more distilled caucus that's mad at the way the leadership led them in the last 2 years, because a lot of them are going to believe, well, if we were more strongly pro-Trump, we would have done better in these elections.
Which actually forced a lot of retirements, which is actually part of the reason we lost as many, because anybody who didn't toe the line was somewhat unwelcome there.
Open seats.
Is it,
More
can,
open seats, yeah.
can you predict at this point whether there'll be an impact on New Jersey of having Frank Pallone ascend to a major committee chairmanship?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually with him yesterday for part of the day, and he's ready.
He's been ready.
He's been ready. But,
For 8
I mean,
years.
yeah, I mean, for longer than that, probably 38. But if you first of all, I think it's very helpful. It's enormously helpful in the same way that Rodney Frelinghuysen was helpful to New Jersey by virtue of where he was on his committee. Frank Pallone chairing Energy and Commerce, which has such a broad swath of responsibility, starting with healthcare, ending obviously with energy and commerce. So I think it's great for New Jersey. I think New Jersey will be getting a lot more. He'll be able to negotiate and deal with other committee chairs in ways that I think he wouldn't have been able to be as ranking member, and certainly not if he weren't chairing the full committee. Henry Waxman, when he chaired that committee, was the template for how to get stuff done for his state and his district, and I think Pallone learned under his tutelage quite well.
I have a friend who lives in Iowa who emailed me and said, I live in Frank Pallone's district, I just met your congressman out here in Iowa. And I thought, is Frank Pallone running for president? But no, he was helping some Democrats running there in order to get their vote for his committee position.
He was hanging out at the Raritan Center Sheraton last night, so I don't think he's running for president. That's not the place to get votes, but yeah.
Well, I think we probably should wrap this up. Though it'd be fun to keep going. I want to ask you each to sort of grade the midterms, if you will, and if you have any parting words. But I just want to say one important element of the election we didn't touch on yet was the Eagleton candidates running for office. I only know of 2 Eagleton alums who were on the ballot. Rupanda Mehta ran a very spirited campaign for freehold. Spirited means you lost, but a very spirited campaign for freeholder in Morris County, and lost. And Musab Ali, who was an undergraduate who graduated here last year, was reelected to the Jersey City School Board for a full term. So any last words from?
A long time ago, when she was still slumming as a spokesman for Bergen County Democrats, Julie told me corruption doesn't matter.
Did I say that?
Yes.
Electoral.
In elections.
Whoever could I have been referring to?
I could give you a list.
I'm sure.
And we had 2 House members who were under indictment reelected. We had a senator who last fall was on trial for bribery reelected. And it's one of these things where we are going to have to deal with how we feel about who we elect. And I would say I believe that Senator Menendez's charges were inflated, that the crimes weren't there, that the government said were there. But that's also because the Supreme Court has narrowed the definition of bribery to like this, like if it's on tape saying here's your bribe, then it's a crime. And beyond that, senators have had, like latitude and longitude, as they used to say in Trenton. So we have to decide what kind of government we want. And as long as it's, we have to be afraid of someone else and stop supporting them because who they might be. I'm going to worry that we may not have any faith in the motives that people have for what they're doing. And this is not an indictment of the senator. I don't want it to come out that way. But it's amazing to me that you could go through what he went through and win as big as he did last night.
Politicians tend not to put politics aside, but I hope they pay attention to what the people want, and I hope the people pay attention to the politicians, because there's a lot at stake in this country, and people get caught up in politics and partisan politics and party politics instead of doing what is best for the country, the congressional district, and best for the population. And that, at the end of the day, is the most important thing, period. I'm not running for office.
We gotta have a chat.
You're sounding more and more like a candidate. I think. So, you know, one of the things that we've been talking about over the course of these last 2 years has been the record number of women candidates. But I think what's also important is the record activism that we've seen on the part of women. And I have been concerned over this period of time that if things didn't go exactly the way people had hoped, that women would sort of drop off, that they would not stay as engaged, and that they would sort of forget what we've been talking about, which is that this democracy that we're in, where we're trying to make sure that our democracy is reflective of the citizenry, is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. And I think that while we did not see the kind of tsunami that I think many people predicted for women, we saw modest gains, but we saw gains. And I think, but I do think that what we are going to see is that continued engagement of women. We saw it in their voting. We saw a gender gap again, as we have been seeing a 12-point national gender gap for women, really trying to shape the outcome of these elections. And so I'm just looking to see, as we move forward, the engagement, is to see if this engagement continues and to see if the numbers of women candidates continue to grow.
I agree with you. And to your point, I was worried after Kavanaugh that women would feel so despondent, that their stories didn't matter, that their activism didn't matter, that at the end, nothing really mattered, and I was hoping that that was not going to be the case. I'm glad to see that it wasn't the case. This cycle, I hope this cycle, not being reflective of a tsunami, doesn't make women feel that they need to, as you said, take a back seat. To your question, John, I think I'll agree this election is an incomplete. As I said, nothing really got resolved. New Jersey being an outlier, but nationally, as I said in the beginning, just underscores the deep, deep divisions in this country. Michael, I think your sentiment is wonderful, but I think as somebody who's kind of a jaded political operative, I would say that unfortunately we win in this country by exploiting divisions, and the president is the best example of that I've seen. Herb, I stand by the fact that corruption doesn't matter because Donald Trump's president. So I don't know why you're focused on New Jersey. We've got a president.
That's what I get paid to do.
But so ultimately, I think we have a long road to go, and I wonder what the precipitating event is going to be to break this fever for us. There has to be a precipitating event. 9/11 was that event. Sadly, almost 20 years ago, I hasten to add that I think if we had a similar event now, it would devolve into partisan finger blaming and finger pointing. And it wouldn't bring the kind of unity. So I don't know what that event is. Something needs to happen, because if we continue down this road, and that road got exacerbated last night by not having any kind of settling of what was going on, I just don't know how this ends. And to your wonderful sentiment, I think we move further and further away from that sentiment with every election that we had, like yesterday's. So, on that happy note.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think Eagleton is great because of forums like this. I think the only way we make things better is to understand that just because someone has a policy disagreement doesn't mean they're the enemy. The enemy of the state, the enemy of you, and people who come and sit in a room like this who completely disagree on policy, you're actually pretty much exactly the same, because you care this much to be in a room like this. Yeah, sometimes we look at our neighbor and say, my God, I can't believe how idiotic that person is. It's completely unfair. And by the way, both sides completely do it. Both sides do it. Democrats have started to look at Republicans like they're evil, and Republicans have done the same to Democrats. And it's not the case. And the only way it gets better is to have some perspective. Last night exacerbated the divisions. We got, as you said, very different results in the middle of the country than you did on the coast. But we've been through this before as a country, and the only way we get through it again is to continue to talk and continue to settle our differences at the ballot box, and no other way. I mean, I say this to my class sometimes. In 1803, the Vice President of the United States assassinated the former Treasury Secretary, right? We got through that. In the 1850s, we embarked on the slavery issue and ended up in a civil war where we killed a huge percentage of our own population against each other. The 1960s saw assassination of the president, assassination of Martin Luther King, the Vietnam War, assassination of RFK. Like, we came through it. It's hard, but like we have to have some perspective. This is hard to go through. In the course of human history, we are still very young in this experiment. 160 years ago, white people could own African Americans. 100 years ago, women couldn't vote. And we almost had a woman president last time. I mean, it goes through growing pains. The country's going to go through growing pains. People fear change, and they go through it. It doesn't make them evil. It means they're afraid. And I think we have to stop looking at everybody who lives in a different state or grew up in a different religion or is of different color as different. They had a different perspective than you growing up. It's very different. If you haven't gone to Iowa, you should. If you haven't gone to South Carolina, you should. If you haven't gone to North Dakota, you should. Just because they were brought up different, just because they don't see the same diversity, does not make them evil, does not make them wrong. Just because they were out of a job and they think Donald Trump might have been the solution does not make them racist. I think we have to look at each other, start looking at each other as human beings again, and it's incumbent upon everybody in both parties to stop being so judgmental. And it's why Eagleton is a great place. It's why Rutgers is a great place, because it gives forums like this. And so I appreciate it. I appreciate you listening to me and allowing us to do this.
DuHaime 2020.
I mentioned Musab Ali being reelected to the Jersey City School Board. He's here somewhere, so I just want to congratulate him. I think just Rutgers. And I know all of you have this in your calendar, but just to make sure that on June 5th, we'll gather here again to discuss the primaries for the New Jersey State Assembly, and it's the morning after that primary. But there are a lot of other events at Eagleton, and for those of you who may not have been here regularly, you can get on our mailing list if you're not there and see some flyers out in the hall. But thank you all for coming.